Welcome to the final CASAA Race Matters Forum of the 23-24 academic year, titled Arcadia Athletics Return on Inclusion, Eliminating Barriers to Inclusion. The CASAA Race Matters Forum was designed as an opportunity to share research, scholarship, and experiences connected to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and combating some of the systems and structures of racism that impact us in higher education and across the larger world. And so we're pleased to have staff and coaches from the athletics department with us today to share some of the things that they've learned and are able to apply to the different sectors in which they work through their partnership with Return on Inclusion over the past academic year. So I will turn it over to Oliver Moe, Coordinator of Student Athlete Success and Leadership, to begin today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Varlak. Good afternoon. Glad to be here. For those who don't know, Oliver Moe. I work in Student Athlete Success and Leadership here with our athletics department. Just want to offer a little bit of general context behind our athletic department's partnership with Return on Inclusion, or ROI, as we call it. So ROI is a sports-specific diversity and inclusion education platform. It's dedicated to developing inclusive leaders and fostering a culture of belonging across social and cultural differences. The founder, Nevin Capel, actually facilitated a training for our staff back in early 2021. So these online modules are self-paced, so they're designed to help coaches and athletics administrators develop the competencies needed to support student athletes and achieve inclusive excellence through policies, programs, practices, that sort of thing. Our entire staff engaged with all 9 of these modules. We had hour-long debriefs after each of the modules. Each of those debriefs were led by a different small group of staff members. The feedback on those was overwhelmingly positive, since it offered, one, an opportunity for community connection as it related to DEI-related topics in our role, but also really because they were presented sort of by folks in athletics for folks in athletics. So they sort of spoke the athletics language. They gave a lot of examples, context-specific things that we were kind of dealing with on our day-to-day roles. So the applicability was something that was very important for us, and it stood out as a good resource for us to continue a partnership with. So the modules for our staff concluded in spring of 2023, but we found that through some staffing turnover and some additions of staff as well, a bunch of our staff members this past academic year did not engage in the modules like the rest of us. So we applied for the CASAA microgrant as a department to pay for 15 additional modules for 15 of our other staff members who have not completed them. So we earned that microgrant, which is why we're here today. Those 15 staff members across a variety of different teams completed all 9 of the modules. They also held debriefs on those, and they planned that the presentation that you're going to be listening to shortly for you all. So I'm very excited for that. We're very thankful to receive this grant as an athletic department, so I'd like to express our gratitude to Dr. Varlak and the rest of the CASAA staff for helping support us in this initiative. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues to begin the presentation.
How's everybody doing today? Again, I appreciate just kind of reiterating what Oliver said. Hopping on here. I know taking out of your day, hour out of your day, probably a lot of things that we can do. So we'll keep this brief, but we'll hit on a lot of different things through the Return on Inclusion modules that we completed. My name's Chuck Thielman. I'm the head baseball coach here. The module I'll be going through is Module 1, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Foundation. So there was 8 chapters through this module that we went through. I think finding a lot of value through this, as Oliver said, in terms of a lot of things that happen within athletics. And I think even just as educators as a whole, that I think really hit home in terms of even some case studies, things like that. Some of the stuff we won't touch on, but this is going to be a lot of the more important stuff that we feel like, or I felt like really connected to what I did on a day-to-day basis, or what we do on a day-to-day basis. So First thing that I'm going to hit on, I thought this was a great saying because I think it was a saying that you hear a lot even a handful of years ago, but treat others how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated, right? I think everybody has their own ideas of how they would like to be treated, but I think if we're looking to create the most inclusive environment that we can, it's important for us as coaches, educators, and just people that deal with different walks of life to be able to really truly understand that. And really figure out how people would like to be treated, right? Because I think that's what allows us to, again, create that inclusive environment. And I think it's, again, just a little bit of a different saying than what maybe people are used to hearing, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. But again, everybody, I think, is different in sense of how they would like to be treated. And it's important for us to be able to get to know that. Kind of brings me into the next part. Everybody is diverse, right? I think the biggest thing that we talk about or people talk about is equating diversity to more of what you can see, right? So you see here race, behavior, gender, action. There's much more beneath the surface. And I think just coming back to, again, the roles that we play in the lives of student athletes, students in general, and even just staff that we work with, just being able to get to know each other a little bit more, right? What makes somebody tick? And I think it just allows us to be more of a shoulder, and again, be more of a safe space for people as well, to be able to be themselves. That's a big thing we talk about within our program is not putting people into a box, right? I think it's important to allow people to be themselves, and I'll get to that a little bit later here. But I think you just get more out of that person when it's all said and done. And I think that's our job to be able to just get to know them a little bit more. Moving on to the next part, unpacking diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So just truly understanding like what the definition is, right? Obviously, there's more of a concrete definition, but to keep it brief, diversity is like a mix of student athletes, right? So in terms of us recruiting and really trying to find the right student athletes, we really try to do a good job of finding a mix of student athletes, right? I think we find value in being able to find those different walks of life because I think it brings a different aspect to us as a team. And I think it allows us to learn a little bit more about each other and really what goes on outside of just being between the lines on the baseball field or court field, whatever you want to call it. So when we talk about diversity, that's one of the biggest things we try to get to is just our mix of student athletes. And then when we talk about inclusion, it's more of how well those student athletes interact. And I know I have in there just student athletes, but I think it's also talking about our coaches, administrators, because I think we're people that are involved in the daily lives of our student athletes and just our students in general, where we do have a big impact. And I think a lot of us maybe here would say, right, you get that text every once in a while where I just appreciate everything you've done or so on and so forth to kind of bring me into the mix here. That really means a lot. And I think more for us in a world of transfers and things like that, I think inclusion is a big topic right now. Bringing new people into your program, being able to kind of have them feel like they are included. And that really comes back to what I talked about before. Treat others how they want to be treated, and really try to get to know them a little bit more to know what ticks. Helps create that sense of belonging. And again, coming back to what I was talking about, getting to know really what makes a person tick and not putting somebody in a box. It allows them to belong and really kind of bring their best selves forward, right? Not feeling like you need to hold back because maybe you don't want to say something and how that's going to be viewed. So just more or less a safe space is the best kind of word that I try to use for that, just so that people really feel that sense of belonging. Moving on to the next part. The language we use to create an inclusive environment. So I know we talk about that a lot, certain words that we use, guys, girls, everybody, things like that. I think that is a really important thing when we're talking about a group setting, right? Because I think we deal with a lot of different diverse student athletes, student groups in general, where the language that we use is really going to affect sort of how that inclusion sets forth. And we're leading from the front, right? So I think the language that we use around our students and our student athletes and even just our colleagues when it's all said and done really sort of allows to bring that out because that's sort of the precedence of what we expect. Moving on, equality versus equity. I have two slides that we're going to show briefly after this where we'll kind of explain it quickly. Equality versus equity, they're two different things. And this was pretty eye-opening to me. And when you see the picture, I think it'll sort of hit home too. The same support versus different support for equal access. And then I'll hit also on the inclusive leader continuum briefly. So you can see here equality versus equity, right? Equality is just giving the assumption that everyone benefits from the same support. So you can see here the fence watching the game. You have different people of different sizes where you can give everybody the same size box, but that doesn't mean that you're creating the same equality or equity that we're talking about. And then when we're talking about equity, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game, thus producing equity, right? So we're always trying to find equity, especially in sports here, right? Being able to kind of make sure that we're all giving the student athletes what they deserve to get out of this experience. And sometimes it does look different, right? When we're talking about sometimes women's sports, men's sports, and even talking about sports just within women's sports and men's sports, sometimes things are needed in different ways. And I think it's important to understand that really hit home for me, just because it wasn't something that I viewed it this way completely. And this picture was pretty powerful for me. We can move on to the inclusive leader continuum. So kind of wrapping up my portion, the inclusive leader continuum. So this is us talking about becoming the inclusive leader, right? So the different stages: unaware, aware, activate, and advocate. So again, unaware, like not noticing or understanding other groups and maybe what some of their needs are. And then moving on, becoming more aware, right? More understanding that you do have a role to play. You might not know exactly how to put that into action, but that's where we move on to the activate. And when we talk about the activate side, when people are more in that leadership continuum of activate, those are those people that are way more proactive, right? They understand, okay, this is something that I have a platform to be able to step up and make a difference, and being able to utilize that. That brings us again, then finally to our advocate, who those are those people, brave actions that challenge ideas. I think we see that on a continuous basis in college and everything in terms of what we do on our daily basis. So kind of talking about that inclusive leader continuum, you could see sort of how that pans along to be able to be that advocate. And the last part I bring up, they talked about as being an accomplice. I think that's sort of our behind the door type thing. And those are the people that have a lot of capital, right? The people that can really make a difference. So we talk about administrators, athletic directors, things like that. So just being able to utilize them as accomplices, right? If we are activate advocates, anything like that, just to be able to kind of help build that impact and make that impact when it's all said and done. So that is it for mine. I appreciate you guys listening.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adrienne Carr. I'm the women's lacrosse coach here, and I'm going to hit some main points from Module 2. So the first thing that Nev challenged us to do with Module 2 was to sit in our discomfort. Module 2 talked about cultural competence and managing relationships, and there were 3 goals for Module 2. One, the first being to develop an understanding of how social and cultural differences affect our relationships. The second was learn how to navigate the dynamics of difference. And the third was to build the skills to manage team conflict. So the first thing, understanding cultural competence. So you can see right up there how Nev describes it, seeing differences as an asset. And really it's about she explains that it's about leveraging difference to help elevate the ability for your team and department to function and grow. The second one was understanding cultural filters. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind just flipping to the next slide. We have a cultural diversity lens here. So it really just talks about like what we see and what we may not see act as filters. So you can see, how do you describe yourself? Think about your own cultural descriptors and realize that they're all a lens from which you see through. Okay, Sarah, you can flip back. Thanks. Okay, so next part, looking inward, and it's really, how can I raise my cultural competence? And to do that, we must look inward. So when we identify these lenses that we're looking through, then we can really raise our cultural competence. And she talked about covering. So covering, and what is covering? Covering is the demand to tone down a disfavored identity to fit the mainstream. So there were 4 A's of covering. They were appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. So, they talked about like, why do we need to cover? Should we feel the need to cover? Do we feel the need to cover certain aspects of our own identity? when we're engaging in these relationships. So next, assessing your team culture. And how would you describe your team culture? Ask yourself, how do you describe your team culture? Is your team culture accepting, tolerant, or hostile? And I want you to think of these how you would describe your team culture when thinking about the categories such as racism, mental health, LGBTQ plus inclusion, religion, and activism. So how does your team, are you accepting? Are you tolerant? Are you hostile when faced with these categories? Okay, next, becoming culturally competent. So they talked about, expanding your cultural intake, taking field trips with your team, engaging with other cultures, engaging with other, exposing yourself and your team to diverse food and areas. So she talked a little bit about that and how you could become more culturally competent. So the last one was action strategies for difficult conversations. And it was really about building relationships across differences. So they talked about a couple action strategies. The first being discuss your plans with your team captains and really set the tone. Have a posture of humility and respect when approaching these topics. Be prepared. Make sure that it's not haphazard. Be prepared with your conversations and realize acceptance doesn't always mean agreeing. And lastly, it was ask for help. There are resources available. You can bring other people into the conversation. It doesn't just have to be you and your team. Ask for help and thank your student athletes for engaging. So yeah, that was really module 2, and I'll pass it back over.
All right, let me pull the presentation back up. Fantastic. So my name's Sarah Birchmar. I'm the head softball coach here at Arcadia. Just have 2 final points to add as we're rounding out modules 1 and 2 before we head into module 3. But just really emphasizing the golden rule versus the platinum rule. Growing up, as Chuck mentioned, we heard a lot of the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. And for a long time, that was a really, really great way to gauge things. But, now that we have learned more about, interactions with other people, and we've become more and more diverse, not only as a nation, but then specifically within, Arcadia and things like that. It's less about treating others how you want to be treated. It's more about the platinum rule of treating others how they want to be treated, the way they want to be spoken to, the way that they receive information, feedback, critique, those kind of things. And ultimately, that all plays into the power of language. Certainly we can do things, but they're never going to forget how we make them feel. And we have the power through language to include them, to make them feel belonged, to make them feel welcomed in this space. You'll hear from more from me later, but we are ready to head to module 3.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? First of all, okay. My name is Riley Durr. I'm from women's basketball. My module was overcoming bias and decoding microaggressions. So to start out, bias is the evaluation or belief that can either be positive or negative, can also be implicit or unconscious, and sometimes we just are not consciously aware of it. It's okay to acknowledge we all have bias. Even having the best intentions doesn't stop our brain from forming our own opinion, either good, bad, indifferent. Sarah, you can move to the next slide. So this was a case study that came out of module 3. It kind of opened my eyes a little bit. Just to go over quickly, a father and son go to a football game where the son attends college. The son then leaves his father to go meet up with his friends a couple rows down and runs into the athletic director, who shouts, "Oh my goodness, it's my son." The module then asked to try to explain this. So the answer is the athletic director is the boy's mother. So my first thoughts were not that. It didn't even cross my mind that the AD could be a woman. From my personal experience, I've always had a man as an AD in all the schools I've been at. So I think that just goes to show that our association with men and power is very strong, and it can interfere with our ability to make accurate judgments about who people are, and we rely heavily on stereotypes and bias when it comes to evaluating people. You can go to the next slide. Another thing that was talked about in Module 3 was circle of trust. So the little circle is your comfort zone, your circle of trust, who you surround yourself with. So thinking about your own circle of trust, are they all women? Are they all men? Is everyone your age? Does everyone look like you? Versus the bigger circle, where the magic happens. So for us to experience personal and professional growth, we have to put ourselves in positions to grow. And to do that, you need to diversify and expand who you invite in your circle. And I'm going to hand it off to Brittany.
All right. Hi, everybody. So Module 4, where we talked about unpacking racism, anti-racism, and privilege. Some of the focuses that we worked on here and some of our goals was us being able to learn how to recognize the forces of racism and use privilege to support student athletes of color. We also talked about developing effective strategies for including white coaches and administrators as full diversity partners in conversations about race. And it really spoke to me in terms of the administrator part. You know, I'm not a coach here. I'm our director of campus recreation. So finding ways to kind of be involved with student athletes and, you know, kind of help them, you know, kind of have a platform to speak out. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we move forward. And lastly, the idea of exploring the historical significance of anti-racism and how we can all confront racist ideas, policies, and practices on teams and again in the department. So Sarah, you can slide over. So I have another case study. I think in our group, between Riley, Reagan, and I, we had some pretty interesting case study examples. So I thought mine was pretty interesting, so I wanted to add it in here. So a conversation that we had regarding this case study. So a coach coaches at a predominantly white institution, and one of your student athletes recently informed you that he plans to take a knee during the national anthem to support racial justice. And before you know it, the entire team has decided to join the protest in solidarity. The last time a student athlete protested, however, one of your boosters tweeted, student athlete should, quote, shut up and play. So therefore you're hesitant to even say Black Lives Matter because of the backlash, but you are mostly concerned for the safety of your student athletes. So a really, you know, peculiar situations for a head coach to be in. And I remember during this conversation, I definitely was picking the brains of our head coaches a lot just to kind of, you know, see what they would do. So some of the responses that we came up with and some of the really good pathways that we kind of had was, you know, first and foremost, you want to make sure that you're thanking the student athlete and acknowledging the courage that it takes for them to confront their race-based violence, especially at a predominantly white institution. So just the fact that the student athlete has the courage to stand up and say, you know, I do want to take a stand over this was, you know, it's a big deal and they should know about that. You want to let the student athlete know that you have their back, even if you don't fully understand what's going on, even if you don't fully understand what they might be protesting against, and you want to ask how they might be supported. How can you, as the head coach, provide a platform for that student athlete to speak up? And then that goes into considering protesting just in solidarity to your student athletes and your team. I think it's definitely important. I think all head coaches would agree that informing athletic leadership of the protests and your intent to protect student athletes, and then also asking for your athletic department's support, letting your team know that bullying and harassment won't be tolerated, and part of being on your team is supporting others, right? You might not all share the same views, but, you know, every team is, you know, working towards a common goal. So if we can find a way to support each other as they want to take on different types of you know, race-based violence, different things that they want to, different topics they want to stand up on is really important. And then I think one of the most important parts is being prepared to engage in respectful dialogue regarding any type of backlash that may come out. So knowing that people are going to share their opinions about something like this, and a team decides to stand up and take a stance on something, knowing that people, especially, you know, specifically in this story, you had a booster who talked about how that shouldn't be a part of what a team does. So knowing that you might get some backlash on that end, and then finding a way to you know, make sure that people, you know, can kind of engage in conversation and move forward and talk about why someone might be doing this and how we can all kind of just come to understand each other. And I think that's really important. Not everyone has to agree on the same thing, but it's the whole idea of, are you understanding where each other's coming from, meeting them halfway and meeting kind of, you know, what their stance is on a situation. Sarah, you can slide over. And then a little bit of a group discussion. Again, I think this was a big topic where we all kind of talked about, how do we tackle some of these uncomfortable conversations? And I remember specifically, I was the first to admit it, why is it so difficult to talk about race and how might this talk about our student athletes? I was one of the first people to say, I have the fear of saying the wrong thing, because you don't want to say something that could offend somebody else simply because you might not know how to word something. I mean, even doing this presentation, you think about, what is the right way for me to explain something or talk about a topic that we covered. So, kind of having that fear of saying the wrong thing and showing, being hesitant and saying something, it can cause your student athletes not to trust you. Or just lose that belief that we're going to stand up for them and that we're going to offer our platform as an athletics department for them to, take a stance on issues. We moved into some misconceptions of white privilege, where we talked about how those with white privilege may not face microaggressions or any situations regarding race at all, which definitely isn't always the case. During the microaggressions part of our workshop, there are plenty of times where they talk about small things that, hit on others. And we attended a couple of microaggression. I know a few of us in the department attended a microaggressions workshop in the CASAA. And, you look at some of these things that it's not always about race. Sometimes it's gender. Sometimes it's, different positions that you're in and, being looked at as someone with a position of power or a leadership role in a department based on age or something like that. I mean, those are things that those are microaggressions that I think everyone across campus can face and everyone in our athletics department can face, not always revolving around race. And then our last part, we talked about some different action strategies that we can use in our Arcadia community and within our department to continue to promote anti-racism. And I do a great job with that. I think Oliver does a great job with that, with our student athletes, providing them a stance of leadership. And, we talk about developing staff procedures and handling situations regarding race, when something happens, what can we do? Kind of being there for each other in that situation, and just continuing to advocate and support Black students, providing them with a platform for students to speak out and stand up for their beliefs, and promoting anti-racism with campus-wide discussions. Like I said, whether it's led by us, what we're doing right now, different workshops across campus, etc. So that is it for my part, and I will pass it over to Reagan for Module 5.
Hi, I'm Reagan Salmons, assistant field hockey coach. So Module 5 focused on LGBTQ plus inclusion and gender stereotypes. I have some key points here, and then each of the next slides will kind of run through each of these key points. So the first one is exploring the varying identities amongst the university and how they intersect in order to create strategies to eliminate bias and create equitable opportunities across all programs, departments, teams, etc. We also looked at creating inclusive programs and teams for this kind of community and non-binary student athletes as well. The next key point was to examine the impact of masculinity, both toxic and healthy, in locker rooms. Specifically was related to one of the case studies, and then how those perceptions can and will impact the team and the sport culture. And then finally, we reviewed some NCAA and Title IX rules, regulations, guidelines, and language regarding LGBTQ athletes within our programs. Next slide. Again, like Britt and Riley did, we had another interesting case study for Module 5. So you're an athletic administrator who oversees men's basketball. On your way to work, you get an urgent phone call from the head coach that a student athlete on the men's basketball team was just outed as gay by a teammate to the rest of the team. You didn't realize any of your men's basketball players were gay, and you want to do everything in your power to protect your student athlete. So these responses, we kind of had the opportunity to talk about it in our group. These responses were pulled directly from the ROI module. So first, of course, you want to recognize the trauma being outed can cause these student athletes, and then meet with that student athlete privately first and foremost, to make sure that they're okay, how they want to be supported, how they can be supported in the future now that you know this information. Next step would be to schedule a team meeting to address the dangers of outing and toxic masculinity, which teaches that gay men don't play sports. And then most importantly with that, reminding the team that this is a harmful stereotype. It's something that kind of, maybe it's not said all the time, but just like most stereotypes, it's kind of underlying there. And we want to make sure that that is kind of eliminated in these environments. And then, of course, reviewing code and conduct for possible violations, and consider taking disciplinary action against the student athlete who outed his teammate, and then avoid speculation, ask for permission to share when a student athlete comes out to you in the future. So here we talk about some of the NCAA recommendations for transgender and non-binary student athletes. This was actually very informational and good for me, at least, to read, to be able to kind of understand better. So just to kind of briefly go over it, a transgender male, a student athlete who's transitioning from female to male, who has received a medical waiver and is taking testosterone, may compete on a men's team, but is no longer eligible to compete on a women's team. On the flip side, a transgender male who is not taking hormones related to gender transition may compete on a men's team or the women's team. Switching sides, a transgender female student athlete who is transitioning from male to female, who is being treated with testosterone suppression therapy or has undergone surgical intervention to suppress testosterone production, may continue to compete on a men's team, but may not compete on a women's team without changing it to a mixed team status. Same thing, transgender woman who is not taking hormones related to gender transition may compete on a men's team, but not the women's team. And then finally, a student athlete who identifies outside the gender binary and are not taking hormones may compete in sex-separated sports in accordance to their sex assigned at birth. If they are taking hormones, however, you have to follow the NCAA recommendations for transgender student athletes, which we just reviewed. And lastly, some inclusive language. I thought this was important to include on here. We have an image on the right that kind of just goes over, you know, some things maybe you don't want to say, maybe some things you do. Some stuff pulled directly from the ROI module, using different sex instead of opposite sex, as this recognizes gender as a spectrum. Avoid using phrases such as preferred pronouns or preferred name, as these suggest that an individual's identity is a preference. Using caregiver or parent instead of mother or father, unless the preferred term is specified. Use sibling instead of brother or sister. Use spouse or partner instead of husband and wife, unless the preferred term is specified. Using same-sex partners rather than homosexual partners or gay partners. And then lastly, avoid using sexual preference, which suggests sexuality is a choice. So all of these language kind of suggestions are, you know, to make sure that you're not making it seem like someone's gender identity or whatever it may be is not a preference. It's, you know, it's what they want to be called. So we should respect that. I think that wraps up module 5. Yep.
Cool. My name is Ben. I'm one of the assistant cross-country and track and field coaches. I'll be covering all of module 6, which is inclusive leadership and strategic plan development. You can see here some of the chapter focuses are, you know, develop a deeper understanding of your core values and where your leadership skill set falls on the inclusions continuum, articulate your vision and create an action plan for personal leadership, and then learn how to reimagine priorities to create a strategic plan that aligns with the evolving needs of a student athletes and coaches and administrators. You know, I felt like all the sort of main themes of this module really all sort of revolved around self-reflection and honesty. You know, a lot of the activities we sort of touched on as a staff in this module were really focusing on, you know, what are both strengths and weaknesses we possess, and, you know, how can we use those strengths and weaknesses to, you know, develop a strategic plan to then be more inclusive leaders. I'm ready for the next one. Yeah, one of the main activities I was talking about was a personal action plan. You know, this is something that each of us could have done, but it sort of started off with going over, you know, what are our core values, what we would best use to describe ourselves as inclusive leaders, and then, you know, what are some potential, you know, the self-reflection, honesty part, you know, what are potentially issues, like problems that these values could get us into, you know, how would we work our ways around these issues? How could we, you know, better, you know, not have these issues going forward, stuff like that. You know, after that was reflecting on, you know, what our greatest accomplishments and failures were, you know, really sort of to gauge, you know, what do we want to accomplish going forward? What did we learn from failures? What did we learn from these great accomplishments to, you know, being more inclusive leaders? After that was setting really sort of firm goals in mind as to, you know, what you would want to accomplish as an inclusive leader, you know, making this could be really anything from, you know, better feedback from athletes, you know, more diversity on your team, anything like that. The last one that was sort of touched on, the personal action plan, that I really liked was having an accountability partner in the athletics department. I really think this can sort of keep all of us really honest with, and really sort of sticking true to what our goals are as inclusive leaders. Having someone that can hold you accountable and be reflecting on what you're trying to accomplish. I'm ready for the next one. Cool. And last up, this is also gone over a lot in module 6, but I really liked it was the multicultural organization development model. I really liked it personally because in my mind, it sort of gave you more of a firm guidelines of what you're trying to accomplish as an athletic department. Starting off, most athletic departments, you start off as a monocultural athletic department. This is an athletic department that really just focuses on, one select group's, style or culture or perspectives on a situation, and really doesn't, value, multicultural, diversity and, every different perspectives on situations. Definitely not the goal. This is not what you want to be. Sort of transitioning beyond that, you would move into more of a discriminatory or transitional athletic department. This is an athletics department that, is seeking to integrate more perspectives and more views into the decisions that are being made, but, it's more tolerance than it is acceptance. It's still, it's better, but not really what you're shooting for. And then the goal is to have that then move on to a multicultural / inclusive athletics department. This is an athletics department that really values and integrates, all sorts of different perspectives, different views on things, and really sort of fosters an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued. And yeah, that sort of wraps it up for module 6.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Adams. I'm the Director of Facilities and Events. I'm going to introduce Module 7, which talks about navigating difficult conversations, which you heard a couple of people kind of bring up. So this one really focuses on how we gain a better understanding of the critical role that as coaches, administrators, and staff we play with our student athletes and also with coworkers, learning how these difficult conversations function and how to use them to build meaningful relationships within our teams, exploring strategies and best practices for engaging student athletes and colleagues in difficult conversations, and to find common ground across social and cultural differences. Barry's going to touch a little bit more on these types of difficult conversations and how to prepare for these.
Yeah, preparing for difficult conversations. When you prepare mentally, share your intentions with others and team members, select a theme for discussion if needed, and do your homework and have open-ended questions ready to initiate discussion. Basically, 3 different types of difficult conversations, or what happened. It's where parties debate about who's right, and then despite who is correct, and no one wins in this type of debate. Feelings, parties talk about how another person has made them feel after an action. And thirdly is identity, which is a conversation where an individual is being branded something that they believe they are not. So those 3 different types of conversations. The other things I took from out of this particular module was the fact that it's hard to have difficult conversations, but studies have shown that your student athletes are already having these conversations. 9 out of 10 have already had conversations about race and other social justice issues with friends and family. So they're just haven't been having those conversations with you, most likely. The other thing that I got out of it was the parameters, which I thought was very helpful. Parameters for having these conversations. They listed 10 parameters in the module, which was ground conversations in respect, which I thought was very important. And obviously the first thing, embrace mutual purpose, respect confidentiality, practice acceptance, seek to understand, use I statements when you can, honor stories, don't interrupt, and write down things if you're not comfortable saying them out loud, and listen to internal messages. I feel like all of these things give you a good blueprint for setting up and having the difficult conversations about these issues.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nicholas Alverson. I'm the esports director at Arcadia, and I will be doing module 8 and 9. So module 8 was inclusive hiring, recruiting, and retention. Stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Impact. These initial stories can shape our perceptions and interactions with individuals. Awareness, recognizing the importance of suspending judgment and embracing openness to truly know others. And preconceptions, examining the narratives we construct about others before truly understanding them. This is kind of just like another golden rule: don't judge a book by its cover. It's really easy to even subconsciously kind of just like meet somebody, maybe whether you're recruiting or you're hiring and you're interviewing somebody, and you kind of just have that preconception of somebody based off of maybe how they're dressed, how they look, anything like that, how they formulate sentences, etc. It's really easy to do that, even subconsciously. So it's really nice to kind of go through this and realize that even if you're not trying to do it, you still just, it's possible just to do it by accident. And then valuing difference, perspectives, new skills, and opportunities. Inclusion must come before diversity. Hiring staff members from different backgrounds, genders, races, perspectives does not make an athletic department inclusive by default. And then prepare the department, build purpose-driven programs, communicate existing inclusion efforts, invest training in all coaches and supportive staff, and communicate your plan. I definitely kind of run into this a lot in my work, and what I do is like when I'm recruiting players and they kind of want to hear more about the program, they don't want to know about just what our plans are for the future, but what we have done in the past and what we are actively doing in the now, rather than just what's the goal for the future. And then inclusive hiring framework, prepare the department, outreach and recruitment, interviewing, hiring decisions process, and then retention and ongoing support. And then wrapping it up with module 9, managing expectations for student athlete activism. What is activism? An undoing of harm to drive social change. So that could be like a protest. It could be kneeling for the Pledge of Allegiance, or what students may be kneeling for. Through activism, students are constructing ideas and perspectives by pressing challenges in college athletics.
All right, so we're just gonna wrap up with some key takeaways here. I know we've thrown a lot of information at you already, so thank you for the attention that you've given us thus far. There's always going to be more and more layers that go into this, more information, more ways to kind of peel back some of these topics and really dive into it. You know, certainly if you get an opportunity, you know, a lot of these case studies were just really cool to give us some understanding, but really just want to wrap up with some takeaways from each of these modules. And so we've listed the module names, because a lot of them really do give off what that key focus is in those spaces. But starting from the beginning, you know, just understanding that diversity doesn't mean inclusion. You know, Nick just wrapped up with inclusion has to happen first before we get to that diversity piece. You know, we could be, you know, fortunate to be filled with a mix of people, genders, sexualities, religions, races, and things of the such. But if we're not inclusive, that's not going to happen for very long. And with that, you know, making them feel included, creating those feelings of belonging allows them to bring more of themselves into that space. And the more that we, you know, create that space, the more, you know, we attract diversity into these spaces. And so it's just a great cycle that we can keep going by starting off on a good foot. And that leads us into the next module right away with understanding that we all have culture. You know, we all have differences. We all come from different backgrounds, perspectives. And so ultimately it boils down to stay curious. For those of you that are Ted Lasso watchers, stay curious, ask those questions, be disinterested in being right. If we get so wrapped up in the idea of needing to be right, we lose sight of opportunities to have conversations with people. And as we look to have conversations with people, you know, we need to start looking into our out group. You know, we talked about in group. Riley talked about people that look like you, think like you, talk like you. And, you know, it's very easy to fall into spaces of our in group. But really just broadening who we bring into our spaces and not making judgments on people that, you know, are part of those out groups that we don't get to spend as much time with. And that leads right directly into racism. You know, there is a big difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. You know, being not racist is good, you know, is great, is a good starting point. But there's little to no work that goes in with that. You know, being anti-racist is where you are going to be an ally. You're going to be stepping up, you know, back to Chuck's point of the leadership continuum, being that accomplice piece, being that advocate, getting to that space, using our white privilege if we have the opportunity to help be that voice or create space for people that don't often get to be heard. Just because we may encounter struggles, if our skin tone is light, but the struggles that we encounter are not going to be related to our skin tone. As we kind of go through the back half of these modules, module 5, really focusing on that LGBTQ space. We all have gender identity, and the more that we can use those words and say those things, I am cisgendered and I use she, her pronouns, but the more that I say it, even though it's technically quote unquote the norm, I'm creating more and more spaces for people that are transitioning, that are questioning, that are, going through some sort of change in their life or perspective of their own life. It creates those spaces to be functional. And so just, again, back to that inclusive language. And then on the backside, module 6, really this inclusive leadership space takes into account, modules 1 through 5 being unaware that, everyone has culture, that everyone has a gender identity, and then getting to that awareness space where you are aware that we have, identities, that we do have culture, and getting all the way to that point of, being anti-racist, getting to be that advocate, getting to be that accomplice piece. If we are going to get to that accomplice and advocate piece, we are going to have hard conversations. And so being able to navigate that, Barry really broke down for us those 3 layers, the what happened, talking about kind of the concrete things, and then starting to talk about the feelings that go into it. And then really that identity piece. And more often than not, that identity piece turns into a conversation with ourselves, about ourselves. We feel attacked because we're being perceived as something, but having those conversations really allows us to then look inwards. Why was I thinking that way? Why did I feel that way? Why was my gut reaction, the way that it was? And as we kind of navigate those hard conversations, either with other people or sometimes with ourselves, that puts us in a good space as we head to module 8 when it comes to hiring, recruiting, retention. Back to module 1 when it comes to the power of language. Inclusion has to come before diversity. If we want to retain and really grow those feelings, we have to make it welcome in that space. It really just allows us to broaden the knowledge and the experience within our department. That's that cultural competence piece. And then lastly, we're navigating a lot of these. We're talking about peer-to-peer and coach-to-player, or boss to coworker, and things like that. But we have a lot of things going on globally and nationally. And so as our athletes and just students in general and coworkers in general want to, to use the platforms that we're fortunate to have, the big things for us is to create space to understand and support them in the best ways that we can.
Now that the coaching staff and other individuals in the athletics department have gone through this training, what's the next step as you see it in terms of application of these principles and practices, either for the department as a whole or on an individual level in terms of your engagement with student athletes? And that could be to anyone.
I mean, I'll take a first crack at it. So Chuck Thielman here, I'm the baseball coach. I think a big thing for us, we're maybe kind of taking it to more of the individual program by program, is more adhering to it day by day. I think the biggest thing for us is just the language used. Obviously, we are in a world of young adults, right? And I think everybody has different viewpoints as they come up. I think a big thing is just us kind of leading from the front. And I think making sure that the conversation is continued to be had. Obviously, we have a lot of different staff meetings, things like that. And there's always a topic of conversation as it comes through. So I think that's going to be the biggest thing, is allowing it to continue to be a conversation. Obviously, we're going away for summertime. A lot of us don't interact with our student athletes as much during the summertime. We don't really get the opportunity to do much with them. So even being able to find creative ways to kind of continue the conversation and just let it be at the forefront. That way it never kind of falls behind or feeling like you need to play catch up. So that would be the biggest way I would say it in terms of application for us as coaches in our programs.
Any additional questions or comments? I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is as you were speaking, members of the Arcadia community have suggested that it's been really difficult to do this justice, equity, diversity, and combating anti-Black racism work because there's limitations on time. And this has been a particular issue among the faculty side of things, that we have so much content to cover within our classes, and how do you find the time to be able to have these kinds of conversations? And so I guess I pose the same question to you all. In the limited time that you have with your student athletes, how do you make sure that the training you've experienced becomes a culture shift in which they learn these kinds of important lessons, and make some of the transitions from maybe more of a monocultural view to a multicultural perspective?
I think we have a unique opportunity to be able to use social media and kind of partner with some things. I think the national months, I know there's stuff for Pacific Islanders. I know there's Black History Month and those kind of things. And so being able to kind of take the topics that already exist and a lot of those charges that already exist, but then using those to kind of spearhead those conversations, these modules allow us to feel a little bit more confident in navigating some of those harder conversations. Are they ever going to be easy and fun? Probably not, just to be really truthful about it. Sometimes they are going to be really hard, but those challenging conversations are the ones that allow us to grow the most. And so I think really the big thing is, we have opportunities to use what already pre-exists, but then using all this knowledge that we've been kind of granted to start some more conversations, and really create that space. We kind of talked about the inclusive language and the power of language. And so the more that we talk about things, the more it opens windows to, I mentioned, like, I would use she, her pronouns, even though, I, appear to be female and maybe perceived as female from others. But the more that I use language like that, create spaces for others to use. And I think that same kind of thought process can apply to those larger topics, to topics about race, topics about gender inequality, especially athletics. We see a lot with transgender athletes, especially more so in that track and field, that swimming space, a little bit more than mine necessarily. But, I think leaning on some of the things that are already in place allows us to maybe have some more conversations.
Any additional questions or comments from our attendees? Oliver, any final statements to close us out?
No, I think on our end, again, we're really appreciative of being able to kind of continue to promote this work and do this work. Again, like, realistically, these modules are great, very impactful, very applicable, but they do cost money. So finding kind of creative ways to have these conversations, and once you kind of have the knowledge and kind of the more tactical sort of know-how to engage in these sorts of conversations, similar to what Sarah was mentioning, but kind of leveraging the existing frameworks that we have to keep pushing these sorts of narratives and conversations forward. So like we have our Athletics Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, where we're kind of spearheading the broader DEI related work for our athletic department. Dr. Varlak, you're a part of that as well. So that's kind of a group within our athletic department that can kind of spearhead, okay, do we want to have an initiative? What are we sort of lacking in a department? How can we address things in a department to promote it and to promote DEI in this space? Like, what can we specifically do for that? I'll shout this group out as well, similar to what you were mentioning, and when you're looking at the broader sports kind of context, and especially as it relates to like Black Lives Matter over the past few years, And given how certain owners were kind of acting, or certain coaches, or like people in those administrative front office spaces not as inclusive, and it leads to those teams not being as inclusive spaces for those professional athletes, student athletes, and a variety of different levels. Like a group that we have on campus here, and it's still in its infancy. So it started out in 2021, 2022, that academic year, is KCLC. So Knights of Color Leadership Council. It's an affinity group for student athletes of color. So sometimes in this space, and we learned this from the modules, just having diversity isn't necessarily enough. Like, you have to have inclusion. And the reality is, if you have a marginalized identity, if you have an underrepresented identity, even if the folks in your space are inclusive of that identity and welcome it and accept it, you still might very well be the only person perceived on that team with that identity. So in comes a group like KCLC. Say you're the only Black student athlete on XYZ equestrian team. We don't have equestrian, but I'm just saying that. So if you're that, you can actually have a community with other student athletes from different teams that might share a similar identity with yours, and you can have that kind of improved sense of belonging. So we definitely want to do what we can to continue supporting that group, although it's still kind of, again, growing in its infancy. But those are kind of the creative spaces where we're thinking as a department, okay, how can we make this applicable? How can we continue to support these initiatives? Highlighting people for Heritage Month, highlighting people for Pride Month, which is coming up. Doing whatever we can as a department to kind of further this educational growth space. And we're only one part of this too. It's part of a broader educational experience that athletics is taking part in, but it's also what we're trying to do as Arcadia University to promote this work as well. So